Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be bringing you mini reviews of everything that I read in May. So I read 7 books in May and that's quite decent, especially like some of the sizes of the books that I've been reading compared to like what I've been reading in the past few months. I've had quite an up and down reading year, certainly in terms of quantity. Like this year I definitely haven't been reading as much as I have in previous years, but I feel pretty okay about that. I'm just kind of adjusting to reading at a slower pace than I used to. And I read a lot of stuff in May that I really liked. I have 4 fiction books for grown-ups to talk about, 1 non-fiction book for grown-ups, and 2 books for younger readers to talk about as well. So without further ado, let's get into the book reviews. I'm going to kick things off with what may be my favourite book that I've read in 2023 so far, and that is You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akwaeke Emeze. So I had read a couple of books from this author before. I had read their 2 YA books, Pet and Bitter, and I really liked those, but I was just a bit confused about whether they actually were YA books or not. I felt like they were like super literary, and I felt like they were books about young adults but for an adult audience. So I was very keen to read something from this author that was just straight up for grown-ups. And I was so impressed by this book. So this is about a woman named Faye who has had a difficult time with dating in the aftermath of the death of her husband. So she's dealing with the grief that she's experiencing, the trauma that she's experiencing in relation to that loss, but also, you know, beginning to allow herself to love someone again or even consider loving someone again. Towards the beginning of the book, we see her dipping her toe into what seems like a really healthy relationship. It seems like it's a relationship that has a foundation in patience and friendship. It's also a relationship that seems to be very advantageous to her art career. Our main character is an incredibly talented artist, but I don't think she believes in herself enough, and she hasn't been, you know, given the opportunity that people who are more well connected in the art world due to positions of privilege, she hasn't been given those opportunities that those people are often afforded. And it seems like her connection with this man is going to be a real opportunity for her to have some of those chances. And a major opportunity involves her going to this kind of dream island escape where she's going to meet with this man's family and some of the connections that they have. I don't want to spoil what then happens, but when there's like kind of light bulb moment where you realize where this story is going to be heading, I was shook, because once she is there, she ends up getting feelings for someone that she's really not supposed to get feelings for. And oh my god, it was just so, like, it was so much drama. I really don't want to spoil it, because if you, like me, are going into this book without knowing who the person that she ends up catching feelings for is, like, it's just such a good, delicious twist. And I love how the book concluded as well, and everything that I had to say about seizing the opportunities that come your way, about loving after loss. And this book also had phenomenal representation of bisexuality in a way that I thought was so nuanced and intricate, but also so seamless and in some ways simple. I think this novel was super commercial in terms of its themes, and it had a lot of themes that you would recognize if you are someone that reads a lot of romance in the kind of traditionally commercial space. But the way this book is written, just on a line level, Akwaeke Emeze is an incredible writer, and I think it kind of elevated some of those themes that I've loved reading about in romance fiction. It had just a slightly more literary edge to the writing that took this to another level for me. This is easily one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book of the year. In May, I also read The Movement by Aisha Malik. This was another author that I'd read from before. So I had read her Sophia Khan books, which are kind of straight up romance books, and also this Green and Pleasant Land, which I read a couple of years ago and was one of my favorite books in the year that I read it. This book was a little bit of a divergence from those, certainly from the romance books. This is very much like a political book that is less about character in the way that I think this Green and Pleasant Land was, and a lot more about kind of a social commentary and thought experiment. So the subject of this book is prompted when a really successful author named Sarah Javid, notably an author of colour, a woman of colour, she decides that she is going to become silent. She is very much in this space of kind of the literary publishing in crowd, but sort of within that space, she is marginalized. She finds herself the subject of a lot of tokenization. She decides to take this stance of silence where she will not be speaking, she will not be writing, and she lights the flame for what will turn into the silent movement. Attention on this movement gradually begins to build, and it is when a white woman begins to speak about the silent movement that it is catapulted to a more global scale. And a lot of the book is about that juxtaposition of something having been started by a woman of color and then a white woman coming in and kind of taking credit for it. The silent movement becomes so widespread, and society is essentially divided into people who are non-verbal and people who are verbal, and there's this conflict between the two groups. There's a lot of judgment from either side on the way of life the other side has chosen. Society begins to adapt to incorporate the needs and requirements of non-verbal people, but then groups of society begin to question, have these non-verbal groups gone too far? Do they have too much control? Have they compromised society as a whole's way of life? And this book has a lot to do with how the political system is fanning the fire of this conflict between two groups. It's a book that explores the idea of when marginalized groups commit to this non-verbal movement, are they doing a discredit to people who had previously fought for them to be able to have a voice in particular spaces? Or in fact, is there power in them being silent? There are a lot of really big sort of philosophical topics being explored in this book. It feels like the author has just kind of thrown a lot of these kind of thought experiments at you, put them in your head, close the top of your head and shaking you all up, and it's like, there, think about them. For me, as more of a character-driven reader, I found that difficult to connect with. So I don't think I can say I necessarily enjoyed this book, but I think some of the thought experiments that the author is raising are definitely worth spending time thinking about. Next, I'm going to talk about the two books that I read on holiday, or at least started on holiday. Although this one, The Visa by Lizzie O'Hagan, I started and finished in one day. So this book is about the romance between Maya and Jack. So Maya and Jack met sort of very briefly at university, but didn't really know each other at all. Through mutual friends, they end up reconnecting, and they realize that they might be of benefit to one another. So Jack is from New Zealand and his visa is about to run out and he really wants to stay in London. Maya doesn't really believe in marriage, so she suggests that they get married in order for him to obtain a visa. This is also beneficial to her because she would quite like someone to move into this flat that she has inherited, which, I mean, I feel like there are more straightforward ways of solving that problem, but she just doesn't believe in marriage, so she's like, yeah, whatever, I'll marry Jack. They are living in this wedded, sexless bliss until Jack starts dating someone and begins to take things a bit more seriously with her, which is really unexpected because Jack's always been a total commitment phobe. Now, of course, what is lingering beneath all of this is that Maya and Jack actually have feelings and attraction for one another. While that sort of will they, won't they, I mean, they obviously will. While that is building, we're also getting an insight into the family backgrounds of both of these lead characters. So Maya has quite a complicated relationship with her father having been absent in her life. And as the novel progresses, we begin to get a greater sense of why Jack really doesn't want to go back to New Zealand and be with his family again, and the loss that he has experienced in his life. I think the concept of this novel is a little bit ridiculous, and there are several ridiculous moments that happen throughout the book, but I think just suspend your disbelief and enjoy the ride, because I thought this book was a lot of fun. I couldn't put it down. I completely flew through it. And yeah, if you're looking for like a quick fun read, I would recommend this one. And it's made me really keen to read more from this author as well. On holiday, I also started Reputation by Lex Croucher, and I couldn't get into this book initially. I think that's because I was just picking it up every now and again and reading little bits, when really I needed to like sit down and properly absorb myself into this book. So when I realized that I was the problem, not the book, I decided to restart it and have like a proper cozy reading evening with it where I could totally dive into it, and that completely changed it for me. I was in, and I was having a really good time with this book. This is a book that is kind of about the debauchery of the in crowd in the Regency era. So it's a Regency era, like, historical novel, but has a really fresh, modern perspective on that, and just playing with the fun that you can have in this time period in a kind of Bridgerton sort of way. So we are following the life of Georgiana, who has been sent to live with her dreary aunt and uncle. And at a particularly boring dinner party, she meets Francis, who introduces her to all of her friends and the kind of in crowd where there is lots of parties going on. And it's kind of about like the chaos of that upper class Regency society. And I think Lex Croucher has really captured a modern twist on that really like wry sense of humor that you would recognize from one of the Regency period's most famous authors, Jane Austen. Some of the observations that are made throughout this book, and quite a lot of the dialogue as well, is so funny. I loved the letter writing that goes between a lot of the characters. I just thought that was so funny. I also loved how this book recognized that there were people of color in the Regency era and also queer people in the Regency era, something that is often overlooked when it comes to pieces of historical fiction. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I will definitely be reading the follow-up, which I think is called Infamous, and I'm really keen to read Lex's YA novel Gwen and Art Aren't in Love. Okay, so now on to non-fiction. So I read Losing It, Sex Education for the 21st Century by Sophia Smith Gaylor. So this is a book about how sex education has essentially got things wrong, about how the way we get our sex education, whether that's from, you know, the limited sex education we receive in school, the education that we end up getting online, how that is just packed full of misinformation and misconceptions, and how a lot of that misinformation and those inaccuracies can be really damaging in terms of people simply having pleasurable sex, but their perceptions of themselves, their body image, their sexuality. This is a book that revealed the really significant harm that is done by a lack of proper sex education and the misinformation that people receive from a lot of different sources. I read a lot of books that are around these kinds of subject matters, so some of the information in here was stuff that I had read before and was very aware of, but it did also bring some fresh perspectives to those topics that I was really familiar with as well. And I loved the openness and honesty of this author in sharing her own experiences as well. So if this is a topic that has interested you previously, I would really recommend this one. If you are someone who's read a lot around this topic as well, there are further insights to be gained from it. But I do also think this book works as a fantastic introduction to debunking a lot of the confusion or false ideas that you might have around topics of sexuality and sex education. And finally, I'm going to talk about two books that I read for work. So full transparency, these books are published by the place that I work, starting with Bite Risk by S.J. Wills. So this is a proof copy. The final book is now out. So this is the first in a teen horror series. So it's not YA, it's not young adult, it's very much teen, so a little bit younger than YA, but for kids who are ready for something that feels a little bit more grown up and, you know, has a bit more bite to it. So this is set in the fictional town of Tremorglade, which seems like a totally normal town with totally normal residents, apart from one night a month. When the full moon rises, the adults in this town are transformed into werewolves. So the kids have to lock their parents up, make sure their parents aren't a danger to anyone, including themselves, and just keep everything ticking along nice and safely until they realize someone is letting the grown-ups out when they turn into werewolves. I thought this book was really fun and really unique. I think the kind of age group that this book caters for, that 11 plus audience, is really underserved. There's not a lot of fiction out there for those kids. You know, kids that are finding middle grade is too young for them. They want to be a bit more aspirational. They want to be reading teen books, but they're not quite at YA yet. And also a lot of YA tends to be about kind of romance, and that's not what the audience of this book necessarily wants all of the time. It's just the right level of scary as well. You know, it's giving like a younger Stranger Things, Fear Street kind of vibe. So yes, very excited to see what happens in the next installment of this series and if it is just as scary. And finally, I read The Night Animals by Sarah Ann Jukes. This is a really moving novel about our main character, who's a young girl named Nora, coming to terms with her mother's diagnosis of PTSD and all of the different emotions that she is experiencing in relation to that. So she goes through being upset, being angry. She has a period of denial and ultimately acceptance. And one of the things that really helps her on that journey through her emotions are these rainbow animals that appear to her. I loved that use of something that is really creative and slightly wistful, and also really celebrates the natural world and animals as something that can be really comforting in difficult and dark times. And the author doesn't shy away from how immensely challenging something like a mental health diagnosis in your family can be, and the direct effect it can have on your own mental health. You know, Nora goes through experiences of bullying in this book as well, so that's something additional for her to deal with too. But that is so beautifully balanced between kind of hope and beauty and friendship as well. I think this author does an immaculate job of like balancing the dark and the light in this book. And it also does such a necessary job of representing a child being a carer of an adult. Yes, I may be a little bit biased because I work at the publisher, but I just love Sarah Ann's writing. This is the second book I've read from her. I thought The Hunt for the Nightingale was just so beautiful, and I will just read anything that she writes. So that is it. They are all of the books I'm going to talk about today. I feel really positively about my reading in May, and it's left me with a really good feeling going into my reading in June. I have a feeling June might be my best reading month yet, but let's check in at the end of the month and see if that actually came to fruition. I may be jinxing myself. Leave me a comment down below if you have any thoughts on any of the books that I have read, or let me know what the best book that you read in May was. If you don't have anything in particular to say, but you want to let me know that you are here, leave me a wolf emoji in celebration of Bite Risk. That is it for me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.